The first one of these documents is an extract of the Apple Supplier Code of Conduct, which is published on the website of Apple. This Code of Conduct presents the principles which are supposed to guide Apple in the choice of the companies they work with. The second document is an extract of an article published in the New York Times in 2012 about one of the Apple suppliers which produces iPads in China. And this article shows the problem of the working conditions of the Chinese workers which work for this supplier. It is the same subject in the third document, which is the cover of a magazine, Wired, a magazine specialized in high technologies. This cover represents a photograph of one of the factories which produce the iPhones in China. All these documents put together can help us explain the strategy of Apple and its impact on people in a globalized world, which is one of the most important debates we can have on globalization today. The strategy of Apple is a strategy of cost reduction because Apple is a transnational corporation. It means an actor in the global village which can consider the world as a workshop. This is said in the document 2. Apple has become one of the mightiest, richest and most successful companies in the world, in part by mastering global manufacturing. When they speak about global manufacturing, that they mean that for Apple today, manufacturing is something which must be thought, which must be considered on a global scale. This is a problem which has become transnational because the production process is operated in many countries. This is said in the first document. On the first line, Apple refers to the countries in which they, the suppliers of Apple, operate. There are multiple countries in which suppliers work for Apple. Most important example is China, of course, where the third document says millions of iPhone are produced and where millions of workers work for Apple. China is part of what Apple calls in the first document the supply chain, because Apple contributes to the International Division of Labor. Some steps of the activities are made in the US, some steps of the activities are made in China, and some other steps in other countries. And globalization enables transnational corporations like Apple to organize the different steps of the production in several countries. The world is like a workshop for them. The interest for transnational corporations like Apple is that they can optimize their investments, taking advantage of the International Division of Labor. The document 1 evokes the laws, rules, and regulations of the countries in which they operate. Of course, the laws, rules, and regulations are different from a country to another. And of course, Apple can take advantage of these differences. For example, in China, we know that the wages are lower than in the United States, for example. China has good infrastructures, so the transnational corporations like Apple choose the optimal place to make their investments. In fact, Apple doesn't relocate a lot of activities because they outsource what they do. By outsourcing, we mean that they sign contracts with local companies. The best example is Foxconn in China, which runs the factory which is photographed on the third document. Foxconn produces iPhones or iPads in the document 2 in Chengdu or in Shenzhen. This is a Chinese company which has signed a contract with Apple. The interest of outsourcing is that Apple is not legally responsible for the production itself. This is the supplier here, Foxconn, which is responsible for the working conditions, for example. So Apple just choose the best supplier, which could make the best job at the lowest price. So for Apple, the strategy is a strategy of cost reduction. This strategy of cost reduction has, of course, a strong impact on the people. The document too shows that they work in harsh conditions. This is what is said at the third line. They must work sometimes 7 days a week. Some days they stand so long that their legs swell until they can hardly walk. Their living conditions are bad too, because the company provides them dormitories, but these dormitories are crowded and they live in very bad conditions. In fact, here, Apple takes advantage of poverty and of rural exodus. Most of these workers have come from the countryside, are very poor, maybe they have borrowed money to travel until the city, and they are obliged to work in order to pay what they have borrowed. The other advantage for Apple in China is the flexible legislation. The legislation is very flexible, and of course you can corrupt the authorities in order to make people work, as said here, excessive overtime, for example, or to take advantage of child labor. They speak about underage workers. These working conditions are also dangerous. It is said in the document that in their factories, the workers improperly dispose of hazardous waste. And this is very dangerous because there are sometimes explosions. They give the example of 2 explosions at iPad factories, including in Chengdu, which killed 4 people and injured 77 people. And it is so difficult to bear for the people working there that some commit suicide. The magazine Wired, on its cover, insists on the problem of suicide, of the despair of the workers working in these companies. In fact, Apple has been alerted. This is said in the second document. Apple knows well what is happening in these factories. It shows that their code of conduct is not respected. There is a shocking contradiction between the code of conduct in the source 1 and the reality described in the source 2 and in the source 3. And Apple knows that. In fact, they didn't do anything of the commitments they have taken in the document 1 about social and environmental responsibility. In fact, they forget totally their social and environmental responsibility. When they say that they want their suppliers to operate in full compliance with the laws, rules and regulations of the countries in which they operate, we see in the document too that even the Chinese law is not always respected in Foxconn. So Apple has a very important responsibility about the evolution of the conditions of Chinese workers, because Apple, in this document too, it said that it is one of the mightiest, richest and most successful companies. So what Apple decides has consequences on the working conditions of the Chinese workers. So does it mean that Apple is simply a very bad actor? Or can Apple answer that they are obliged to do that in fact they can't respect their supplier code of conduct? In fact, Apple is aware that the world is not only a workshop, the world is a battlefield for Apple. They consider the world as a village, and a village can be a place where several companies compete. When we speak about mastering global manufacturing in the document 2, we mean being competitive. The necessity for Apple is to remain competitive. It means having the best products, of course, the best quality products, but also having the lowest costs. And they have sometimes to make choices. This is what is said in the title of the source too. The choices are always made against the human in place. If they reduce costs, it will be the human costs they reduce, because it's the costs which are the easiest to reduce. In fact, it's pretty logical, because the function, the role of a corporation is not to advance social and environmental responsibility, as they say in the first document. The role of a transnational corporation is simply to make money. It depends on the other actors who should organize themselves to limit the possibilities of making money in such conditions. In the world considered as a battlefield, the companies are obliged to grow in order to reach a global size, and this is what Apple does if they want to remain competitive, because there are competitors on this battlefield. The document 2 says that Dell, Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Lenovo, Motorola, Nokia, Sony, Toshiba, and others, it means in fact everybody, does the same. It's not specific to Apple. We speak about Apple because this is an iconic brand, but in fact it is the case of all the other companies, and if Apple didn't do that, the others would do it anyway. If Apple wants to carry on competing, it's not stupid to say that they are obliged to behave that way. In fact, the responsibility could be the one of other actors. This is suggested by the document 3. In the question they ask, in the bottom of the cover, this is where your gadgets come from. Should you care? There is a very strong opposition between the word gadget and the word suicide. We confront here a human tragedy, the suicide, and the futility of what it produces for us. And then the most important question is the last one: should you care? It shows the responsibility of the consumers who can choose to buy Apple products or not. It also shows the important role of other actors in the debates on globalization. The press, like the magazine Wired, is absolutely necessary to inform the people about the consequences of globalization. And there are other actors, like the non-governmental organization. They speak about them in the second document when they evoke the advocacy groups in the middle of the text. These advocacy groups must be able to work in order to record and to denounce the problems which can happen in companies working for transnational corporations. So, in fact, globalization relies on a lot of things we don't say, because for actors like the consumers, we can try to imagine that the world is limited to our very limited everyday horizons, whereas the real winners of globalization, like the transnational corporations, are aware that the world is like a global village.